How many of something do we need to understand what's going on? We're going to do a little bit of math today, but I promise it won't be too much. And then we're going to move on to talking about building assets and building your setting, building your world. Let's start here with a little tiny bit of math. If I show you two numbers, 1, 2, do you know what number comes next? The short answer is you don't. Let me show you 4 possible things that it could be. It could just be a counting series. It could be 1, 2, 3, 4. So the next number is just the index of where you are. So the 5th one is 5, the 17th one is 17. It could be a doubling sequence, 1, 2, 4, 8. Each time you go up, you're doubling the next number. It could be something like 1, 2, 4, 7, 11, and so on, where you are adding onto the previous thing the current place that you are. So to find the 17th number, you take the 16th number and add 17. This is actually how experience points worked in 3rd edition D&D. You added your current level times 1,000 onto the amount of experience you needed to get to the next level. Or it could be that the pattern isn't really mathematical at all. It could just be going 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. And the reality is that there's a multitude of other possible things it could be. So with just 2 numbers, we don't actually have enough information to know what's going to come next. And actually, if you look at this list, you'll notice that there are actually 2 different sequences that go 1, 2, 4, and then something else. So even with 3 numbers, we may not have enough information to know what's going to happen next. When we are building out systems, when we are designing functions to do the work for our video games, we need to make sure that we put the test cases in place to actually make sure that we're getting what we want. If we just test the first one and the second one, we're not really sure that what we've designed is actually working. It's not that uncommon to see this in the work of early systems designers, where they build what they think is a nice, robust mathematical formula for leveling up. And then it turns out it completely destabilizes at the upper levels. But we can extend this beyond the more technical aspects of game development, beyond functions, beyond the way that the math of our progression systems work. And think about this from the perspective of content creation and world design. For content creation, if we only need one thing, then great, make one thing, no problem. But if we need more than one thing, we might decide that we need to make a second one and use that to decide how the different subcomponents work together, how the overall design is functioning. And that gives us some additional information, but it may not give us enough. If we build a level and we create all the parts necessary to build a level, and then we go to build a second level, we're going to find that we're reusing some things, but we're not going to necessarily know where the weaknesses in our reuse exist. Only once we start creating more levels, once we start creating the 3rd or 4th level, do we realize that reusing the encounter templates, no problem. That feels fine. It feels rational that the encounters behave in a certain way. But reusing that one piece of wall art is proving to be incredibly noticeable. And we need to make more of those in order for the levels to feel right. Let's try to really anchor this down to a real world example. You make a level, it's a desert level. You make a tile set to build that level. You make a weather system, you make a day-night cycle, and you make creatures and props and treasure that fill that level up. When you go to make a second level, the first thing you realize is you can't reuse the layout because otherwise it's the same level. So by adding a second level, you've at least discovered that you can't just reuse the layout. But you can reuse everything else. You can reuse the tile set and the encounter design and the treasure and the creatures that you created. And now you have a second desert level. Do you know where the weaknesses in your content pipeline are yet? You don't really, because you might just be building a lot of desert levels. So maybe those tiles, maybe you don't need any extension on that tile set. You don't know that yet. When you go to build a third level, now you start to see a few more cracks forming. It's starting to feel really samey that we're using the same tile set over and over again, that everything takes place in a desert. The creatures are still feeling okay with 3 levels. We can still get enjoyment from fighting this same palette of creatures. Treasure feels pretty universal, so we're doing well. And each time we add another level, we're putting additional stress upon the assets we've created. And different kinds of assets are going to accept that stress in different ways. We may find we never need to add additional treasure, that the treasure we created to create that very first level is enough to carry us through the entire game. Whereas we might find that we can only make 2 levels with any one tile set before it starts to feel overused. And if that's the case, we need to consider how much effort we're putting into building our tile sets. If we're only getting 2 levels out of each tile set, then we aren't necessarily getting the savings we expected to get from building those tile sets. Maybe we shouldn't use tile sets. Maybe we should just make every single level custom. As we test our content creation systems, as we test the edges of how it works, we're going to find that different things are going to react to that pressure in different ways. Making only 2 of something isn't going to be enough for us to start to see those cracks forming in most cases. Making at least 3 is going to give us at least a chance to start to see the places where we're going to need to put in more effort, and to show us the places where maybe we're putting in effort that we don't need. I'm using making here pretty generically. Some of this stuff you're going to be able to figure out, or at least get hints of, during your planning process. When you are planning out the levels that you think you're going to need, you can probably figure out that everything can't be a desert level. But even things we think we can get away with, even things we think are going to be adequate, our creature palettes, or the number of different chairs that exist, things that look like they're going to be fine in the planning process might underload in real world situations, prove to be inadequate. So we should do this exercise. We should make at least 3 of things at multiple stages in our development. Plan out at least 3 different levels and figure out where things are obviously not going to work. Build at least 3 different levels so you can see where new cracks form. Polish at least 3 different levels so that you can see where that additional burden causes further cracks to form. If all we do is build 1 level, or all we do is build 2 levels, we aren't stressing the different parts of our level creation pipeline in a way that shows us where the weaknesses actually are. Is 3 enough to put strain on the systems in such a way to show those weaknesses? Not necessarily, but 3 does a much better job than 2. 2 is going to show you where you are reusing things, but it's not going to show you where that is unacceptable in most cases. When you move to 3, that repetition starts to become more evident. And the areas of level design where it's okay to have that repetition will feel okay still. Whereas the areas where the repetition is already wearing out its welcome will start to show. In a perfect world, you might make a 4th level. In asset creation, 2 usually isn't adequate. 1 is fine. It goes from nothing to existing in some form. You have proved the possibility of creating a single thing. At 3, you're showing that it's possible to make a multiple number of something. With 2, you aren't yet showing that. As we go to world design, as we go to our setting, 2 can be a really interesting but often problematic number. If we have 1 source of magic, great. All magic comes from the source, no problem. If we have 60 sources of magic, in a lot of ways that's almost the same thing. Magic comes from one of these many places, so the rules don't really matter that much. You probably don't have a super hard magic system in place. But when we only have 2 sources of magic, there is an automatic relationship implied by there simply being two of something. If I have two important characters in my setting, the player is going to automatically assume that there's an important relationship there. Either they are rivals, or they represent opposite philosophical stances, or they're married, or they're father and daughter, or something that connects them together. Now, maybe we want that dichotomy. Maybe we want good and evil, law and chaos. Maybe we want there to be this tension there. If we don't, we end up in this world where we have an implied relationship that we don't want. So we need to consider that if we're going to have more than one of something, going to two and often to three is going to imply things that we may not want. Now, you can have that tension, that relationship beyond two, beyond three. Magic the Gathering has 5 different colors, and each color has 2 oppositional colors. So black is opposed by white and green. Green is opposed by black and red, and so on, creating this pentagram of different oppositions, where each color is opposed by 2 other colors. But you're choosing to do that. Once you move beyond 3, you're able to sort of set that aside, push that into the background, and not worry about it quite so much. And if you want that dichotomy, you can still get it. You can have a magic system with multiple sources and then put another group or single source as oppositional to that first group. In something like the Dragon Prince, you have the elemental sources of magic, like air and water and so on, and then you have dark magic set as a dichotomy, as a separate thing in opposition to that group of magic. The relationship between those 4 elemental magic doesn't really need to be super strong for you to sort of lump them into a group and then put a second thing on the other side of it. If you look at the Dragon Age setting, it has struggled with these different magic sources. It has too many or not enough, depending on how you look at it, and has spent a lot of time trying to move these sources into a few smaller piles so that those relationships can be built and can become clear. You want your setting to be internally consistent. So you either want there to be relationships between the different forces that can be understood and explained, or you want it to be such that that question isn't really ever asked. No one asks where magic comes from in Harry Potter. It's just magic. There's just magic about. If you want a harder setting, a setting that has stronger internal consistency, then when you introduce more than one of something, you need to consider how those multiple things interact with each other. And the fewer things you have, the stronger that implied interaction is going to be. 2 things implies a very strong relationship between those 2 forces. 22 things, it's much weaker, and you're able to get away with a much softer explanation as to the relationship of the various components. Hopefully this makes sense. Hopefully I didn't lose everyone in the first 5 seconds when we talked about the math a little bit. When we think about how many of something we need to go through this kind of calculus. Do we only need 1? If yes, that's awesome. Then we're done. Great. Just make the one thing. If we need more than 1, do we only need 2? If we only need 2, then consider the relationship between those components. Are we emphasizing that relationship? And if not, are we implying a relationship that we don't want to be? Once we move beyond 2, we should consider if the answer is many. And if it is many, what does that look like? How do we determine the pattern that will emerge as we move into many? A special thanks to my members. They provide the resources that this channel needs to keep running. If you're interested in becoming a member, there's a link to that down in the description. We also have a Patreon if you're more comfortable supporting the channel in that way. Both Patreons and channel members get access to our Discord, which is a great way to interact with our community at a deeper level. I am tying 3 different concepts together under a single overarching umbrella. The concept of mathematical progression and the programming functions that you might build that work in such a way, the concept of building different assets and how many assets you need to really test out your pipeline, and the concepts around building a world and the different oppositional forces in that world. Am I being successful in tying those 3 things under a single umbrella? Let me know down in the comments. I will see you again soon. Thank you.